everyone, my name is Hayley Boxall. I am a research manager at the Australian Institute of Criminology and I head up the Violence Against Women and Children Research Program. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I am shooting this video from, which for me is the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be watching online. I would also like to acknowledge the funders for this research, which is the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, as well as my fabulous colleagues who assisted with this project, which is Laura Doherty, Dr. Siobhan Lawler, Christy Franks, and Dr. Samantha Bricknell, as well as our advisory group comprised of amazing individuals who gave their time really generously to help us do this massive piece of work. So how do we prevent a crime like intimate partner homicide? This is a question that has been asked of violence against women and gender-based violence researchers for decades, for hundreds of years, because when these events occur, they are so shocking, they are so heinous that we have to try and understand, and we have a moral obligation to try and understand how these events can be prevented from occurring in the first place. So the research that has been conducted previously that has aimed to understand risk factors associated with intimate partner homicide has looked at things like the nature of the abuse within the relationship, so whether or not there were non-fatal strangulation events, whether or not there were stalking incidents and the presence of coercive control, as well as looking at factors associated with the individual perpetrator, so their childhood, their upbringing, and so on and so forth. And while this research is really helpful for giving us a bit of a picture of the risk profile of individuals who may go on to murder their partners, it presents quite a static picture of risk. We know that individuals at different points in their lives can be put onto different paths, which can stop them from ultimately murdering their partner. It can be disrupted, it can be interrupted, and can be diverted. And that's ultimately what we wanted to do with this project, was to develop an understanding of the pathways into intimate partner homicide, specifically male perpetrator intimate partner homicide, where the victim is a current or former female intimate partner. So specifically, we were looking to understand those major events, key milestones, and factors in the life histories of an offender that may ultimately lead towards lethal outcomes. So broadly speaking, what we did was extract a sample of approximately 200 cases of male perpetrator intimate partner homicide that had occurred in Australia over a 10-year period. So 2007 to 2008, 2017 to 2018. We stratified the sample, which was randomly extracted by the Indigenous status of the victim and the offender, as well as the jurisdiction, so that we could get a broadly speaking, nationally representative sample of homicides that occur in Australia. So as you can see here, the majority of the cases that we included as part of our analysis came from the eastern seaboard states, so Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. So the data that we used to basically do this deep dive analysis included data holdings held by the AIC through our National Homicide Monitoring Program, as well as coronial records and sentencing remarks. So I'm not going to go too much into the data component of the project because that information is provided in detail in the actual report, but there are a couple of things that we need to be mindful of about our sample. So our sample does not include cases where the offender suicided, and it does not include cases where the offender was found not guilty by reason of mental illness. So the reason for not including cases where the offender suicided was primarily a logistics kind of question, because there was just simply less information about these cases if the offender suicided prior to sentencing occurring. However, as part of our sample, we did include cases where the offender was charged with and/or convicted of manslaughter. However, to be included as part of the sample, they had to have at some stage been charged with murder, regardless of whether or not this was downgraded prior to sentencing. So based on our analysis of our almost 200 cases of intimate partner homicide in Australia, we identified 3 discrete pathways. So these were fixated threat, persistent and disorderly, and deterioration acute stresses. However, consistent with what we know from typological approaches more generally, there are going to be cases that do not fit neatly within one of our identified pathways. And so you can see from this Venn diagram that we did have cases which we referred to as crossover cases, which exhibited traits or I guess components of 2 or 3 of the 3 trajectories. And we also had a series of cases that were classified as unknown because there simply wasn't sufficient evidence for us to be able to classify them into 1 or more pathways, as well as outliers. So these were cases where the ultimate decision by the court was that homicide occurred in the context of self-defense, or what we know as euthanasia or mercy killings. However, when we look at our 3 primary pathways, this did account for approximately 90% of our overall sample. And so it does demonstrate that it does have some veracity when we actually look at broader samples of intimate partner homicide. So let's start talking about some of our pathways. So the first pathway, fixated threat, what did this look like? So these cohort of offenders accounted for about 1 in 3 of our overall sample. And this cohort really looks very similar to the work that Jane Monckton Smith has done, where she identified 8 stages to intimate partner homicide. So although they did not account for the entirety of our sample, they did account for about 1 in 3. So in the pre-relationship stage, we see these guys as typically what we would kind of refer to as very high functioning in many public facing domains of their lives. So they are typically employed in well-regarded industries. A number of men actually owned and ran their own businesses, which I found really, really interesting. They were also highly educated, so of the men who had completed university level education, they were primarily in the fixated threat category, but more, I guess, qualitatively, they were referred to as upstanding members of the communities. They were involved in charity services and so on and so forth. This isn't to say that these men did not have histories of violence. About 1 in 4 appeared to have been violent towards a previous intimate partner. However, they did have very low levels of contact with the criminal justice system. So we talk about these men as being not very visible for various reasons to the criminal justice system. At time of the relationship starting, the relationship between the victim and the offender was characterized by high levels of power imbalance between the victim and the offender, favoring the offender. So oftentimes this power imbalance was attributable to the victim's younger age. So on average, the victim was about 7 to 8 years younger than the offender, although there were some cases where there were almost 30 years age difference between the victim and the offender. But also in many circumstances, this was the victim's first real relationship, and they may have started their relationship even from a school kind of age. So there were power imbalances within this relationship. Other attributable causes for this power imbalance were things like language barriers. So in a number of cases, the victim and the offender had immigrated to Australia, and the offender may have been the one with the English speaking skills, and so the victim was reliant on them, as well as financial dependence on the offender, particularly if they were stay-at-home carers. However, one of the key characteristics of these relationships is that the offender was described as being very controlling, domineering, and jealous. So very unlikely that they would perpetrate physical forms of abuse against the victim, but they were definitely coercive, controlling individuals and were perpetrating a range of different non-physical forms of abuse. A key stage in the trajectory of fixated threat offenders was that at some point in the relationship, their feelings of security in the knowledge that they had control over the victim started to be challenged. Primarily, this challenge was in the form of the victim choosing to leave the relationship. So overall, the vast majority of cases in the sample, the victim and the offender were together at time of the lethal violence occurring, but where there was a separation, it was primarily the fixated threat guys. So around 60% of fixated threat offenders were separated from the victim at time of the lethal violence. However, even in cases where the victim and the offender were still together at time of the lethal violence, there did appear to be a power shift within the relationship. And this could have been that the victim returned to work after a period of time of leaving the workforce to care for children. It could have been that they started to succeed in their career or become more financially independent from their partner, as well as to really kind of, qualitatively important but difficult to detect things like forming new social relationships that previously they wouldn't have had done, or even just not acquiescing to the demands of their partner on a day-to-day basis. But regardless of the source, the key kind of point is that the feeling of control that the offender had over the victim was starting to be challenged. Against this backdrop of the offender losing control over the victim, there was what we kind of saw as an escalation period where the offender basically started to ramp up their controlling behaviours as a means of trying to re-establish control over the victim. So in the context of separation, this often looked like repeated attempts to reconcile, so pleading, attempts to get them to come back into the relationship with them, emotionally abusing new partners that the victim might have had. It could also look like text bombing, repeated calls, stalking them online and in person, which was really crucial, but also could have been about trying to socially, restrict their movement, so trying to forbid them from seeing people, interfering with their relationships more, and so on and so forth. However, in the vast majority of cases, there was no reconciliation in the context of separation, and the victim continued to obstruct any attempts by the offender to re-establish control over them. And so against this backdrop of a loss of control and frustrated attempts to re-establish this control, what we see is what Jane Monckton Smith refers to as a change in thinking. And so what we see here is that the offender becomes more motivated to use lethal violence as a means of re-establishing control over the victim. So the change in thinking, stage in this trajectory was evidenced through things like the offender starting to verbalize threats to kill to the victim, their new partner, or to family members and friends. It could have also been planning behaviors as well. So pre-planning prior to the lethal violence was not a significant feature of the sample more broadly, but where planning was present, these were the guys who were doing it. So about 1 in 4 guys were engaging in pre-planning activities. So this might have been educating themselves about how they could do it, laying false alibis, research, purchasing materials to do the deed, and those kinds of things. And so finally, when we come to the lethal violence episode, offenders entered the same space as the victim with a clear intent to at least very seriously harm her, if not kill her. So these were the guys who would use subterfuge and manipulation and force to gain access to the victim. So doing things like breaking windows, sneaking into the house when the victim wasn't home, and so on and so forth. And they were also the ones who were most likely to bring a weapon with them into the scene. We can also see the level of pre-planning involved based on what they did after the event as well. So many men in the sample in general engaged in concealment activities after lethal violence incidents, but these were the guys who engaged in very sophisticated forms of concealment. So laying, again, false alibis, hiding weapons in very difficult to find places. And they were also the ones who consistently pled not guilty, and they were also the ones who appealed against their sentence and were seen to show very little remorse. So basically what we see with the fixated threat guys, who accounted for about 1 in 3 of our sample, is that a key stage in the trajectory was a loss of control and the use of lethal violence as a means of re-establishing control. So let's look at pathway 2. So what does this look like? So our persistent and disorderly cohort accounted for 40% of our overall sample. So they were by far the most common trajectory within our sample. So what do these guys look like prior to the relationship starting? So they look very different from the fixated threat cohort in that they have very high levels of contact with the criminal justice system for both violent offending towards intimate partners, as well as other family members and friends and strangers. They have high levels of alcohol and drug use dependence issues. So about 3 in 4 had AOD issues. There were also high levels of mental health concerns within this cohort. This cohort were also the least educated within the sample, and they had the lowest levels of consistent employment. So we talk about these guys as being very visible to the criminal justice system for various different reasons, which I will come back to. So in the context of the relationship starting between the victim and the offender, oftentimes what we see is that these relationships were described by coroners and sentencing judges as being toxic, codependent, those kinds of terminology. And we know that those are really problematic terms because they do underplay what is really abusive behaviors. But what we did see in the relationship is that they were characterized by high levels of physical abuse perpetrated by the offender against the victim. They were also the shortest term relationships. So they were typically very short-term relationships, about 2 years long. But also that there were repeated bust-ups, so they would break up quite frequently and then they would get back together again. But at time of the lethal violence, what we saw is that the majority of these offenders had reconciled with the victims at time of the lethal violence. So what this means is that not only were they characterized by high levels of physical abuse and separations and reconciliations, but they were very persistent. So they continually did come back together again. So for a number of men included within this trajectory, what we see is that a key stage in the trajectory was that their contact with the criminal justice system escalated in the lead up to the lethal violence incident. And what this typically looked like was the offender being charged with physical assault against the victim and as a result becoming the subject of court orders. So these court orders would typically put limitations on the level and frequency and nature of contact that they could have with the victim. But what we see is that because one of the characteristics of these relationships is their persistence, is that even in the context of charges pending against the offender for physical abuse, as well as the presence of court orders, is what we see, what sentencing judges refer to as breaches by consent of these orders, which is really, again, very problematic because can a victim consent to be abused? Not really, but what we do see is that the relationship continued and the victim and the offender continued to try and occupy the same spaces together. However, because they knew that their relationship was under an additional level of scrutiny from law enforcement, but not only family members and friends who may have disapproved of the relationship, a number of offenders and victims engaged in what we would call service avoidant behaviours. So they started to spend more time alone by themselves. They tried to spend time in isolated areas together where they couldn't be observed, and so then law enforcement wouldn't be tipped off and then the offender charged again. So for example, in the context of protection orders being put in place, a number of offenders within this cohort, within this trajectory, started to go bush with their partner and go on camping trips where they wouldn't be observed. At time of the lethal violence occurring, one of the crucial things that we kind of observed about these incidents was that they were not differentiable necessarily from other acts of physical abuse that had happened previously within the relationship. However, lethal violence as an outcome was more likely in these circumstances because of situation-specific vulnerabilities that may not have been there previously. So for example, it might have been that the offender and the victim were both very highly intoxicated. So about 80% of victims and offenders in this cohort were intoxicated at the time of the lethal incident. It may have been that there was a weapon present that there would not have been previously, and so the offender grabbed hold of that and was able to perpetrate more harm against the victim, as well as the absence of capable bystanders or, capable guardians, if we're going to use the language of routine activities theory. So because of service avoidance and people spending less time in the presence of other people because of concerns about being detected by law enforcement, there may just not have been someone there to stop the offender from going too far, which may have been what had happened previously, stopping the victim from being murdered. And this was something that was noted by a number of sentencing judges and coroners, was the consistency between the lethal incident itself and previous patterns of violence and abuse within the relationship. So in these cases, we can see that there wasn't a huge amount of pre-planning involved, in the sense of they didn't necessarily come into the same space as the victim with a clear intent to kill them, and the decision to perpetrate serious harm was a relatively spontaneous one. And you can see this evidenced by the fact that many of the men in this cohort were very remorseful after the event. They typically sought assistance for the victim, and they also pled guilty. So the final pathway that I wanted to talk about is deterioration and acute stresses. And this is the smallest, cohort within our overall sample, only accounting for about 11%. However, the narratives that we pulled out of the data were sufficiently coherent for us to identify this as a pathway in and of itself. So in the pre-relationship stages, what we see with these guys is that they are relatively high functioning in some domains of their lives, which is consistent with the fixated threat guys. So they may be consistently employed, they have very low levels of engagement with the criminal justice system, and where they do is for minor non-violent offending. However, one of the key characteristics of this cohort is that they have persistent and chronic mental and physical health issues. And in particular, physical health issues was very common within this cohort. So this could be things like heart conditions through to chronic pain, acquired brain injury, and so on and so forth. Alcohol and drug use was also an issue with this cohort, but less so than with the persistent and disorderly trajectory. So at time of their starting the relationship with the victim, one of the interesting things about the guys in this trajectory is that by all accounts, the relationship was positive, loving, and functional. And there is some, I guess we have to take this information with a grain of salt because we don't have the victim we don't have a victim voice within our data set. However, this information was provided by family members and children of the couple. So there is some, I guess, credence to that information that's being provided. Also, these relationships were very long-standing, committed relationships. So the average length of relationship for this cohort was about 20 years. And they were married and they had children together and had been cohabiting for most of that time. So these relationships characterized by longevity, functionality, and I guess non-abuse as well. There's very little evidence of abuse within these relationships. However, a key stage in this trajectory is that at some point within the relationship, the mental and physical health of the offender started to deteriorate. And this was attributable in many cases to simply the aging process. So physical health conditions that the offender may have had in his 20s and 30s just consistently got worse as he got older. We saw this for a lot of guys who had things like chronic pain as well as arthritis and those kinds of degenerative diseases. However, it may have also been attributable to the onset or escalation of symptoms associated with new conditions, or the, I guess, kind of rolling impact of health conditions on other domains of their lives. So for example, there are a number of cases where the offender had been able to work steadily throughout his life, but because of his health condition, had to stop working, took early retirement, and that started to put financial pressure on the relationship. And so they may have started to drink and use drugs as a means of coping with that. So in the context of the deteriorating mental and physical health of the offender, it's not surprising then that conflict within the relationship with the victim started to increase. So there was reports of increased arguments between the victim and the offender. Oftentimes it was about the impact of the offender's deteriorating mental and physical health on the relationship and on the victim. It may have been attributable to the victim asking the offender to seek help and the offender not being ready or willing to seek help. It could have also been attributable to the onset of abuse within the relationship. So we saw in about 2 or 3 cases that the offender started to become very emotionally abusive towards the victim during these later stages of the relationship. However, again, like the persistent and disorderly cohort, even during these kind of rocky conflict-ridden parts of the relationship, there may have been a separation, but by and large, they had reconciled at time of the lethal violence occurring. So the lethal violence incidents for this cohort were the most difficult to understand. And this is primarily because the offenders themselves seem to have real difficulty understanding why they had killed their partner at this point in time. Typically, we see in the scene that the lethal violence occurred in the context of the victim and the offender being in the same space together consensually because they were living together, they had a relationship, and they were going about their day-to-day kind of lives. In many cases, the offender became incredibly intoxicated or started to experience symptoms associated with other underlying mental and physical health issues. And then they just kind of say that they had an argument and then they killed their partner. There didn't seem to be, like with the persistent disorderly, there didn't seem to be a huge amount of pre-planning involved. The decision to kill their partner seemed to have been relatively spontaneous, as evidenced by the high levels of remorse expressed by this cohort in the aftermath of the case, as well as high levels of pleading guilty and not appealing any sentencing decisions that may have been made. So I wanted to kind of finish up this presentation by picking out and talking a little bit more about some of the key differences between the 3 trajectories, because at this point it's probably just a big wad of information. It's very difficult to kind of disentangle who does what and what are the differences, or what the differences are. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was offender visibility. So one of the key differences between the three trajectories was the level of visibility associated with the offender at pre-relationship and during their relationship with the victim. So in particular, what we see is that the persistent and disorderly offenders were highly visible to law enforcement compared to the fixated threat and the deterioration acute stressor offenders. And this is primarily attributable probably to the fact that they were involved in high levels of offending generally, like violent and non-violent offending. But something else to keep in mind is that we know from research is that policing is concentrated around particular communities, and that the police are going to pay more attention to offenders who exhibit certain traits. So for example, the fact that a lot of the offending may have occurred in the context of alcohol and drug use may have increased the visibility of these guys to law enforcement, as well as the fact that they had high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. So they may have been living in social housing, they may have been transient, they may have been homeless. Another key characteristics between the three trajectories was the nature of the abuse within the relationship. So overall, what we see is that at least for the fixated threat and persistent disorderly offenders, the vast majority of them were detected for being abusive towards their partners at some stage within the relationship. So for the fixated threat offenders, as I kind of said previously, the abuse that was being perpetrated against victims was primarily coercive control, which manifested through non-physical forms of abuse. So this included things like stalking, intimidation, text bombing, socially restrictive behaviors, and so on and so forth. The persistent disorderly offenders were also controlling, but the manifestation of that coercive control was through persistent physical violence. So as I said, a key characteristic of these relationships was the persistent levels of physical abuse, as well as jealousy and persistent kind of emotional abuse as well. So just in terms of how the, abuse manifested within the relationships is quite different. And then we come to the DAS offenders, and as I kind of said, there was very little evidence that they had been abusive throughout the relationship, and when abuse had been referenced, it was typically characterized as minor. So for example, one family member said that they had seen the offender push the victim on one occasion during their 15-year relationship, and that was the extent of the abuse that they had observed. Another key difference is the role of separation in the trajectory to intimate partner homicide. So the majority of FT offenders were separated at time of the lethal violence, and as I said previously, the loss of the relationship and more broadly loss of control was a key stage in the trajectory. However, what we see is that the majority of PD offenders had separated at least once prior to the lethal violence occurring, but they had reconciled at time of the lethal violence. So the loss of the relationship wasn't necessarily as key a factor in the, spontaneous decision to kill their partner. And we see the same with the DAS offenders, that the vast majority had never separated from the victim, and even those who had separated from the victim were reconciled at time of the lethal violence. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the timing of the decision to kill. So this has been talked about in some of the literature and in academia about intentionality. So did they intend to kill their partner? And this is a really difficult thing to ascertain because you can't really get into the mind of an offender at time of murdering their partner. We can talk about how their emotional state, in terms of how their emotional state manifested. We can talk about did they enter the same space as the victim using subterfuge and manipulation. We can talk about how if they did any kind of pre-planning prior to entering that same space, and so on and so forth. But I think to meaningfully engage with questions around intentionality, I think it may be more useful to talk about the timing of the decision to kill. Because even if it's a spontaneous decision, if it's an instantaneous decision that someone acts upon in a split second right before they murder their partner, it's still a decision that someone makes. And so I think we need to be mindful that there is intentionality. It's just about when someone made that decision. So what we see is that compared to the PD and DAS offenders, the FT offenders entered the same space as the victim with a clear motivation to kill them, and pre-planning was very common. So these were the guys who were making threats to kill, they were engaging in pre-planning behaviors, and they engaged in sophisticated concealment activities after the fact. However, when we look at the PD and DAS offendings, the decision to kill appeared to be more spontaneous. They did not necessarily enter the same space as the victim with an intent to kill them, and they didn't really engage in pre-planning and so on and so forth. And if there were threats to kill, this was primarily as part of the overarching patterns of abuse within the relationship more generally. So I'm going to leave that with you there. The report is now available on the Anne Rose website and on the AIC website. I encourage you to have a look at it. As part of the report, we go into more detail about the intervention points, so how do we disrupt these trajectories, as well as the sampling methodology more broadly. But when we're trying to answer that question of how do we prevent a crime like intimate partner homicide, we have to look at the life course. We can't wait until risk escalates to the point where we're looking at safety planning and things like that. We need to look at this as a journey that can be disrupted at different points in time. And thank you.